Whakatau mai rā te ātāmira teitei o te hunga whakairo me te hunga toko whakairo he whakatau mai rā he.
Tēnā rā koutou ngaitahu, kei konei Maui ki a kōrero atu ki a koutou, mō tā mātou krema ki te krauna o te wai Māori. Nō reira, me whakamārama i tēnei kōrero ngaitahu. Greetings. Lizzie and I are here today to talk to you about the claim that we've filed before the High Court on Friday, 27th of October. And that claim, and that statement of claim is wai Māori and our claim to fresh water. So we have no option other than to file with the courts. We're taking action against the Crown because if you go through our landscape, the waters have just been destroyed. If you go to Temuka, South Canterbury, they can't pick watercress out of the creeks that they've grown up on. The same in North Canterbury, Tuahiwi, but this is the same right throughout the island.
Spectrum presents The Long Locum, the first of two programs in which Dr H.B. Turbott looks back on some of the incidents of his long career in public health. The program is introduced by Alwyn Owen.
I went back to my job in Auckland, but shortly, at the end of the year, I was appointed to be the Medical Officer Health for Gisborne District, which was the Wairoa right round the East Cape up to Wakatani.
What year are we talking about now, Doctor?
I'm now talking about 1928.
28.
I was to be the MOH, deal with the things which the MOH usually dealt with in those days. I was to be the doctor to the school service and generally to do whatever I thought I could do to help the Maoris. Now, the Maoris needed help because there was no social security. The Maoris couldn't pay the white doctors. The white doctors wouldn't go to serve them because they never got paid. And the result was the Maoris got sick, stayed with their sick at home because they hated going to hospital, because if they did, they usually died.
There would be an element of tohungarism too, still, would there, when you went there?
They had a very active tohunga movement throughout the whole district. And they went to the tohungas rather than go to the tohunga didn't ask for big fees. He took something from the family, but it would be something that they would give. After about a year or so, it became obvious that I must tackle the apparent tuberculosis, which seemed to be amongst them, and their preventable troubles, skin troubles and so on. Typhoid fever was fairly rampant among them, so we'd have to start a typhoid immunisation campaign, as well as one of water and care of the faeces.
It wasn't easy to start such a campaign, and the health department wouldn't even provide the funds necessary for a survey to quantify the position. Dr Turbott applied for and was granted a Dorothy Temple Cross Fellowship, which carried a grant of £1,000. But the survey ran into problems. The Maori people refused to cooperate, and Dr Turbott discovered that the word had quietly gone out from Sir Apirana Ngata that they were not to assist in the survey. The doctor drove overnight to Wellington to see Ngata.
The secretary was there, and Ngata, and he said, "Now, what do you want?" So I explained to him what I've been trying to do, the purpose of the task, and that at the end of it I hoped to be able to do something to cope and stop the spread of tuberculosis among his people. At the end of the talk, about now got to almost to midday, he said, "Now, you go away and come back at 2 o'clock. So I went back at 2 o'clock, and he said, no secretary, no notes being taken. And he said, "Now, what do you really want?" I said, "I want you to ring the elders, take Sam Goldsmith, for example, whom I know you deal with a lot. Ring him and tell him that you've heard what I'm trying to do, you approve of it, and you want them to help me." All right. He rang in about 2 or 3 minutes, he was through, and he said, "Sam, I've got this fellow Turbott with me. I thought he was a Pākehā trying to win medals to pin on his breast through showing up the disease among the Maori people. I find I was wrong. I want you to help him to get on with the work." Well, I went back to Ruatoria, and in the next 9 months the whole study was completed. At the end of the study, I had found approximately 5.6% active tuberculosis at the moment in the Maori people. The next task, of course, was to what on earth am I going to do for this active tuberculosis? The first thought was to put up a village, tuberculosis village. That was the way the British were dealing with it at the time. So I spoke to Sir Api about it, and he said, well, I'll give you a plot of land next to the Te Hospital, which he did. Says you can use that. But I got cold feet about it because I realised I'd have to feed them and generally manage the whole place. I cut the thing down to making a little hutment which could be transferable, could be put next to the house of the active spit sufferers, and my nurse could teach the family barrier nursing.
This would work in better with the whole Maori social system of the home too, wouldn't it, Doctor, I should imagine, than taking them away from their home environment.
It was acceptable to them, this idea, and in the first months or so, I was getting these built in Gisborne, transported 3 at a time in a lorry and put to the houses. Gradually, my red dotted houses where there was active spit were all occupied with one of my hutments with the case in it. At the end of about 3 years, the tuberculosis officer, I was translated to another district, but the tuberculosis officer told me, your scheme is working. The Manto test is showing now that the Maori people are nothing like infected the way they were before you started your scheme.
Looking back over this period, there was little you could do other than palliative, restorative remedies for people who had TB, but you could, with this barrier scheme, prevent its spread. Am I right in that summation?
You're quite right. The modern treatment of tuberculosis is very successful, but it wasn't available in those days, and it was only a matter of trying to block the spread, and that was the whole intent of the scheme.
As a sideline to your years on the coast there, did you see anything of mate Maori, the Maori sickness induced purely by psychological means?
Yes, I had a case of it. The nurse took me one day to see a Maori man. Apparently, I would say in the pink of fitness. It seemed to be nothing wrong with him. I could find nothing wrong with him for the nurse. And she said, well, he's had a makuta put on him, and he thinks he's going to die. He won't eat, he won't do anything, he's dying. Well, I said, that's all silly, and I told him it was silly, that he was, as far as I could tell, he was quite healthy. However, he duly died. He just starved himself to death, and that nurse couldn't do anything, and I'd failed to convince him that he wasn't dying, but he died all right. A tohunga had put a makuta on him. I don't know why. But that's the only case I personally dealt with.
Spectrum presents The Long Locum, the second of 2 programs in which Dr H.B. Turbott looks back on some of the incidents of his long career in public health. The program is introduced by Alwyn Owen.
If you heard the first of these 2 programs, you'll know something of Dr Turbott's early life, of his work as a young house surgeon in the Waikato Hospital, and the period spent in a mission hospital in South China. As interludes, there was a locum in Otago and a brief stay in Western Samoa, immediately following the Maori disturbances in that country. By this time, Dr Turbott had firmly decided to be, in his words, a health man, working in the field of public health administration. His first such appointment was to the Auckland district, and then followed a move to the North Island's East Coast area, where he mounted a vigorous and successful campaign against typhoid and tuberculosis. Then came another move.
I was translated to Waikato, in charge of that district for 4 years,
Let's peg our years now. Where are we approximately now, Doctor?
I'm now in 1936, arrived in the Waikato to find, as I go around examining the Maori children and villages, that they've got the same trouble as was existing in East Cape. In other words, tuberculosis was one of their main troubles, and typhoid fever again. The villages in 4 counties where I had a survey done, 4 Maori counties, they were spreading 85% of their faeces in the manuka, outside anywhere, not in a privy, and they had water supplies which were, many of them, definitely unsafe, often below where they, from a spring which drained from where they spread their faeces. I had a village with only 12 homes and 2 cases of typhoid fever, very serious cases, in a village where they had no privies, went in the manuka. The spring was down below the manuka, and a Maori had visited them who was a carrier of typhoid fever, with the result 2 desperate cases in that village. So we started a campaign of inoculation. It was one way you could tackle it. The other way was to give them clean waters and make them use privies. Now, Tapuia was the reigning princess. I went and explained to her what I was trying to do. I would have privies built, transported along the roads to their home. The Maoris would have to sledge the privies over to their place. They'd have to build a support stand, chop wood and build the stand for it. And I would also try to supply a tank for every house so that they could have, from their tin roofs, they could have pure water.
Could you give me a picture of Tapuia, as you recall her?
Tapuia was a charming lady. I happened to get on with her right from the very start when I was shifted to Waikato. I went to see her and told her that I couldn't do very much unless she was willing to help me. And that approach apparently was the right one, because she never failed to help me in the 4 years I was medical officer health for the Waikato region. She began, for example, at the time my nurses were having difficulty in getting Maoris to come to antenatal. And I told her of this difficulty, and I said, you lose a good many babies, and we would like to help, but your people aren't coming. Would you allow my nurses to set up a clinic in here, in your chief marae here? She said yes. And actually she mothered the clinic, and that was very good, because there was some prejudice against dealing with the towards the end of the time, pregnant women. They were supposed to be left alone and not mishandled and so on. Then later on, I went to her again and said, now this is what I'm going to do. Typhoid is 36 times more desperate for you Maori people in these 4 counties, where they haven't got proper water supplies and where 80% or more of them are broadcasting their faeces in the manuka. I said, what I want to do is to put up a tank against the whare and a whare paku
Outside toilet
in the nearby. He said, well, what would my part be? I said, well, I'd want you to deliver, because you have lorries, and to deliver the whare pakus to the houses and the tanks. I said, well, you want me, a princess, to go around with whare pakus? I said, no, I don't want you to go around, but I do want your lorry and your driver. So she gave in, and she delivered in the next 8 or 9 months or so the privies and the tanks, which I was buying through the works department. And she carried that out faithfully. The Maoris had, of course, collect these from the roadside and drag them over there to their places, and they had to do the work of erecting and looking after them.
Had Tapuia established Turanga Waiwai when you knew her?
Yes. She was living in there, and her husband was doing all the sort of managing the farming and so on. And she was the great factor behind all that progress by the Waikato people.
How would you describe her qualities, Doctor?
Oh, above average, I would think. She quickly grasped anything you wanted her to grasp. She had the faculty of getting her people to do what she wanted them to do, so that she had the way of managing people. I think she was a very fine woman myself, and I had 4 years of getting to know her and working with her.
She was also skilled in working in the European area, working with government, working with local bodies, etc., wasn't she?
Yeah. Yes, she was. She had a way of getting on with most people, I think. At least that's what I always found.
Now, to finance this doctor, you had to go and see Peter Fraser, as I understand it. Now, tell me about Peter Fraser and your relations with him.
He was a fairly tough controller of our department while he was our minister. But when he became Prime Minister, he grew into what I considered as more or less a yes man. In other words, he didn't like to have contrary opinions, contrary proposals of what he thought was best. Well, a lot of people are like that, of course. But in my case, he tried to block me talking about the need to do more for the Maoris. He said I shouldn't bring out in the open the disease and the trouble that I was finding. On the other hand, I thought I should. And I kept trying to raise public opinion in the area I was to help. For example, the Waikato Rotary I persuaded to help to build a hostel for the Maori people who couldn't get accommodation when they came down to hospital, and therefore they didn't want their relatives to go into hospital and to get treated because they couldn't come to visit them, because no hotel in Hamilton at that time would accept a Maori.
It must have been rather like an irresistible force meeting an immovable object then when you and Fraser got together. Because neither of you were the type of people to give way, were you?
No. I after talking to the Rotarians and persuading them to help me, it got around a bit, and I was invited to talk to the annual conference of Rotary in Napier that year, which I did. And the request was to tell them what I told the Hamilton Rotarians. So, of course, I did. The newspapers got a hold of this, and there was a couple of columns or more the next morning. Then I got a wire from Wellington. I had to come down to see Mr. Peter Fraser. And when I got down there, I was in trouble because I had again talked about the need to help the Maoris with their troubles. Anyhow, he said, "What do you really want?" And I said, "I want to get a good water supply and a privy to every Maori home to strive against typhoid fever." But he said, my lands department, my Maori department are doing that. I said, "No, they're not." I said, "In my district, they're putting up small houses without a piped water supply or a tank water supply and without a privy." He said, "I don't believe it." I said, "Well, I can produce photos to show if you like." He said, "Oh, no, I'll get you to go and see Mr. Langston, my minister."
This is Minister of Maori Affairs.
Maori Affairs, which I did that evening. And he also said, "But that's what you say hasn't been true." Well, I said, "Would you care to look at these photos? Because they're in the districts that I serve." And there was the photos of a no attempt at a tank or a water supply, no privy, and this was in multiple housing. So he gave in and said, "All right, you've proved your point." Then he said, "Mr. Fraser wants to see you again." I went back to Mr. Fraser and he said, "Now, tell me in plain language what it is you want to do." I said, "I want money to be able to build and put to each Maori home in 4 counties where they are broadcasting faeces and so on and causing typhoid fever. And it would be £40,000 I need." He said, "All right, you go back and you do it." But he never forgave me for that contrary opinion, not doing what he told me the first time, even though he gave in and let me get on with the job. The typhoid death rate fell within the next year to exactly the same as a Pākehā. It had been 36 times higher.
There were some notable medical personalities, weren't there, in the 30s, 40s?
Times. But he was a good sound doctor. There was no worry about his work.
Did you come into contact at all with Dr. Peter Buck, Sir Peter Buck, as he later became? Yes,
when I went as Assistant Medical Officer of Health to Auckland in 1928, he was Director of Maori Hygiene. Now, he was very rarely in the building because he was mostly away delving into his
ethnology,
which was his first choice. And actually, as to doing something for Maori hygiene, the year I had in that office, I don't know if they did anything. It may be a little far-fetched to say that, but there was no impression of anyone in the Auckland office that he was on the job at all, except for his own ends, way down the Bay of Plenty or in Urewera or some other territory where he was chasing up some back history for his work.
He subsequently, of course, went to the Bishop Museum, didn't he, in Hawaii?
That's right. Actually, I had very little contact with him because he was hardly ever there.
It was in July 1943 that you gave your first Radio Doctor broadcast. How did that come about? Where did the impetus come from for that?
It came from Mr. Peter Fraser. He had that week sacked Scrivenger from being director of broadcasting.